Walk around health and AI is written on every single booth, nearly every single booth. But truly, if AI can make a difference in our lives, a profound difference, it is in genomics.
Yeah, I think this is really a conference where technology and healthcare converge.
Functional precision medicine is the orchestra coming together and playing those notes in harmony perfectly.
Great picture.
And the conductor is AI, making adjustments in near real time based on the environment.
We're spending so much money on healthcare. We're happy to spend $300,000 on a drug, but we can't seem to spend $300 to figure out whether or not that drug is going to work. That math doesn't math, and so
we have so many benefits. We spend millions, tens of millions of dollars on benefits, and we're not seeing the results in our claims data.
While everyone's thinking about the direct consumer, they're going to have to really start connecting those dots on who are going to be the entities that are most likely to pay for it, why are they going to pay for it, and how does it connect to care.
This is really important, and I don't want it to not be mentioned. Community. Whenever you have a health condition or a mutation, community is so incredibly important. And there are things that you'll learn from community members that you're not going to learn from doctor offices.
If you empower yourself, and in my life, it's always been a no is a starting point to a yes. Don't confuse your 7 years of going through a medical textbook with my entire life. And I can say that for myself, literally my entire life. My PhD is personal history of the disease.
Damn.
And you cannot tell me that I'm wrong.
you are not going to stop this consumer wave. It is unstoppable.
This is Genetics for Healthcare, a podcast for patients.
Welcome to another episode of Genetics for Healthcare, a podcast dedicated to patients and their caregivers to help advocate for precision medicine approach to their healthcare, which includes disease screening, treatment, survivorship, and prevention. I am privileged to have Alva 10, the CEO, co-founders of Alva 10. I'll ask you guys to introduce yourself. There's a lot going on here, and I'm glad you're here with us because I'm flat out overwhelmed. Like this is a crazy, crazy show. Health is the largest health innovation show in the world, and I see why now walking through here. And I'm glad that you guys are here to help me break it down and bring information to our audience that can help them be better advocates for their health care. So, if you will, just introduce yourselves and tell us a little bit about Alva 10.
My name is Mamauszka. I am CEO and founder of Alva 10. I'm a scientist by training. I spent about 20 years in the diagnostics industry, but we started Alva 10 to really fill the gap between the great diagnostic technology that is out there that can really impact patient care and the lack of payment and provider knowledge that means that patients don't get access to it. So we work with payers and employers to help them understand ways for diagnostics to improve care. Lena?
Great. Thanks so much. Great to be here. Lena Chaihorsky. I'm the co-founder and vice president of Payer Innovation here at Alva 10. I'm a mathematician academically, but I spent my career in diagnostics, really trying to solve this problem, right? We're spending so much money on healthcare. We're happy to spend $300,000 on a drug, but we can't seem to spend $300 to figure out whether or not that drug is going to work. That math doesn't math, and so that's why I'm here trying to fix that problem. So really excited about all the great work we're doing in the space.
So, Lena, tell us a little bit about the health conference, like as a whole. Like, what is this conference? Who attends? Again, I'm still like mentally tired. It's only a half day here. Tell us a little bit about the conference.
So health, we laugh about this a little bit, I think. Health is a huge, basically a tech conference that happens in Vegas every year. I think it's about 16,000 people now. And it's so overwhelming because I think a lot of times when we talk about healthcare now, we're talking about Apple technology. So for years, there was a lot of digital. It was a very digital forward conference. And I think this year is particularly exciting because this is the first year that there's a diagnostics track in health, which means that diagnostic companies are really here and showcasing for the first time. You don't have to sort of sift through all the digital leads to find the diagnostics. It's a lot easier to have those conversations in health this year. So that's sort of what the conference is. And I think one reason that we're super excited to be here this year.
So, Hannah, give me an example, because I think you and I talked about this years ago. When you asked me, was I going to health? I'm like, what's that? And I mean, it was 10,000 people then, and I didn't know was coming to the show. I just knew that Bloomers was performing, right? But what's an example of the innovations as far back as you can remember that were announced here or that were talked about here that you see as mainstream now?
Yeah, I think this is really a conference where technology and healthcare converge. You and I have grown up going to a lot of clinical conferences, going to oncology conferences, going to scientific and technical conferences. We're usually focused on one disease. And health is really disease agnostic. It's really about technology and different technological applications, either digital health, diagnostic health, now a lot of AI that can be brought in to implement and try to change in healthcare. I think some of the more interesting ones here this year and in years past have been actually around sample prep and around getting samples from home.
Really?
A few years ago, well, maybe a decade ago, everyone was talking about Theranos, which is the company that we don't like to talk about, but really sort of brought to the front of the mind this ability to do easier blood testing, either blood testing at home or smaller samples, particularly for people who are afraid of needles or don't like to go to the doctor, that this would still be a way that they could get their blood testing done. And, Theranos didn't work out. That was a bit of a fraud. But that concept and that technology of how can we take samples from home? How can we make it easier for the patient? What are the technology applications that we usually do in the lab? How can we bring those closer to the patient and make them more accessible? And I think COVID really taught us that patients do want to be involved in their healthcare, but they would like more of their healthcare outside the healthcare system. They would like it closer to home, either at home or at their pharmacy or at a local clinic. They don't want to go to the hospital. They don't want to go get a big blood draw. And so a lot of the applications here are around how you can bring diagnostic technology closer to the patient.
So give me an example, because AI is on every booth here, right? But with respect to genetics and genomics, what, in terms of disease care, is new and exciting that you're seeing that is going to be something that really makes its mark in the future of healthcare?
So I think there's a couple of things. I think first of all, I've seen a couple of booths here already. I think people are talking a lot about this now, where people have very large data sets, right? And there are data sets of all kinds. There are claims data sets, there are EHR data sets, there are genome sequencing data sets. And I think it's been very difficult for people to figure out, what is it that we need to find in these data sets? And it's been very difficult to find those things. And I think now, like I was talking with a vendor here today, that they're basically like cheaper genetic sequencing, right? So if you want to make something and you want it to be sequenced, you can work with this lab. But then they also sort of mentioned it, we're also trying to build out these algorithms and figure out what else can we find in the DNA, right? So I think there's this open culture now of trying to figure out how do you get the most out of the data that you have. And are we leaving things on the table, right? If we have diagnosed a certain condition, or we have a blood sample, or we have a DNA sequence, is there something else that we can find there that's valuable? And I think that's going to be a question that's going to be asked, probably for the next few decades at least. But I think that when we think about AI and we think about all the data that we have, and that's probably an area where a lot of people are going to find value.
Yeah, and I think the other thing is, when we came a few years ago, the first time we came, which is probably like 7 years ago, maybe 6 years ago, there was a lot of technology that was kind of cool technology for the sake of technology. Like, okay, you can take a sample at home, but what are you going to do with it? What biomarkers can you analyze? Like, not every biomarker is frankly relevant to be analyzed at home or on a daily basis. Some things you should be in the hospital to get checked for. So figuring out what is that match between your cool technology and the ability to take a sample at home, or the ability to analyze something in the CP office, and the clinical utility in terms of how it's going to change the management of patients. But like I was just at a session where they were talking about a ability to monitor immune function for oncology patients at home. And so right now, if you are on treatment for oncology drugs, you are, you get your treatment, you go home. But if you get a fever, you're told you should go to the ER and get your blood drawn and see if you're having, either an adverse event, an adverse reaction, or you're having an immune function issue, which is very common in oncology. But it's not ideal for oncology patients to be going to the ER on a regular basis, both because it's inconvenient and because it exposes them to a whole bunch of, other stuff in the hospital. And so, a really interesting application is to be able to track their immune function at home and say, do you need to go to the ER? If you don't need to go to the ER, don't go to the ER. But a few years ago, these were just sort of applications that they hadn't figured out what the utility is. And I think this year we're really seeing utility for tests. Now the question, of course, is who's going to pay for them?
Okay, so that's the perfect segue into care delivery, right?
Yeah.
Tech innovations, like I said, for the sake of innovation, it's cool to talk about, but it gets to where the rubber meets the road when payers are aware of it and they want to pay for it, or that it just becomes more affordable for people to have access to. So, Lena, what have you seen or are excited about here that is going to improve payer adoption and coverage of these precision medicine test tools or otherwise?
So I think it's a couple of things. And, almost before we get to payer, let's just spend a second on the clinical care piece. Because I think that actually also has a really interesting AI segue. I'm also seeing the clinical care companies that I'm seeing here that I'm meeting with. I see a lot of, agentic AI that helps you interpret results. One of the biggest things I've been hearing is how frustrated people have been with the Function Health panel. Function Health, $499, I think it is, $499 for 100 biomarkers from blood, right? Great. But then people are staring at 100 data points and they don't know what these things mean. And then here comes the AI. They don't understand the relationship between these things. And actually, I think a lot of times science doesn't even yet understand the full relationship between these things. But the reason I think it's so important is because, and I actually talk about this a lot, it's exciting to see other companies agreeing with me, I think, in this area. Care in general is a set of functions that are performed today by a human. Some of those functions can be performed by AI. And sometimes the closest AI is closer than the closest human. And sometimes the closest AI is better than the closest tired human.
Okay, that's a powerful, powerful statement you just made. I want you to repeat that because that is very logical and it's very accurate for a patient or someone who's non-medical to get in their minds about how powerful these tools can be to help them take control of their health.
So part of this is the way that I kind of think about it is when I'm a patient and I have a piece of information that I need interpreted, or I have a symptom that I would like to get contextualized, the thing that I want is I want a board certified doctor, right now, and if I'm lucky, I can text one and hope they get back to me in the next week, or I can get myself onto a, wait list and see an actual specialist in network, which you think about 9 months.
Yeah.
And so the question that's being asked in agentic AI is there an AI that is closer than the closest human? Not perfect by any means, but is going to help you get a little bit closer to your answer, right? And so you start to look at a physician as kind of a whole series of functions. And then you start to ask how do we take kind of these lower level functions and we load them onto AI? How sometimes it's almost like actually a really good allegory for this is Talkspace, which was behavioral health box, right? Back in the day, you're feeling overwhelmed, you can text a therapist, right? $25 a month. And, were you having a full conversation? Was that therapist going to get you closer to answering all of your problems? Probably not, because you're sitting on the subway, maybe having a small panic attack or something. But you are getting closer to care. that person helped get you over a hump, right? And so we can think about agentic AI in healthcare as a very similar way. Like, you don't need a board certified physician necessarily to walk you through all the ins and outs of your 100 data point function test. But maybe you just need some of these top level questions answered. So the reason I bring this up is because I do think that, like, when you talk about diagnostics and precision medicine and genetics and genomics in healthcare, and we talk about payers, there's like a canyon, right? And the canyon is like care, clinical care, physicians, agentic AI, the tools that help us get answers.
Right.
And so then the payers need the technology to work with the care. The payers are kind of saying, you guys need to figure that part out, right? Because we don't want to pay for technologies where we don't understand the value, or patients can't get that information, or they can't act on it. And what we do as payers is we pay providers. So can you guys kind of work it out amongst yourselves? And so that's where I see a massive opportunity to really change and reshuffle how this works. Because I think we're seeing, I'm meeting with companies today that are basically a virtual hepatology care clinic, right? These guys have hired a bunch of hepatologists, and now they are setting up virtual clinics. They are leasing to hospitals and want to talk about leasing to employers. That is, I think there's a big future there.
Yeah.
And so then you start to get excited. You're like, oh my gosh, well, what kind of diagnostic test could these people, start to talk about or start to run that is way more than what that health system has access to? So anyway, I don't want to get us off track too much on your payer question, but I did just want to sort of bridge this topic with clinical care, because I think it's a really important part of it. My one I could say my biggest pet peeve with this conference today is that nobody, and I think you mentioned this, but nobody has solved for payment. You're talking to these diagnostic companies, you're talking to these clinical care companies, and you ask them, who are you selling to? And they're trying to sell to traditional insurance. They're selling to hospital systems. And everyone sort of knows that employers are in the wings, but they don't know how to access them. I think this is probably one of the most exciting next generation conversations in healthcare and healthcare economics. Because if you think about it at large, a traditional insurance company only sees and values a very small percentage of the value proposition of precision medicine. The people who get the most economically from a person being well is a person's employer. And now that they're stepping into the game,
It's powerful.
it changes the whole thing.
Well, Hannah, like on that same track, we're talking about what's going to drive adoption and payers, but there's a workflow solution that she was talking about that has to be there as well. Talk about the kind of barriers and what are you seeing here, or what needs to be seen to make that patient workflow or that clinical workflow such that they can get access to these things in timely manner.
Yeah, I think traditionally everyone has thought about how is Medicare and how are commercial payers going to think about this. And I think those are going to be the two slowest entities to connect all of these dots. Medicare is always the most conservative. But I also think there's a generational shift in attitudes around data, around healthcare. I think that my parents' generation, the boomers and kind of older, are very sensitive to their healthcare data. They don't like their data being out there. They grew up in an era where I think people were afraid to talk about genetics. They're afraid to talk about risk. They had this sense that if you got diagnosed with something, you didn't want anyone to know.
That's right.
You didn't want your employer to know. And I mean, for all, and somewhat for good reason. Whereas now, the populations that are aging into healthcare, the Gen Xers and the millennials and the younger populations, are very interested in using their data in healthcare, and they're willing to put it out there. They're willing to take down the barriers that have been put in place to say, I don't care about that, to say, I want you to use it. I'm going to ask my physician a question. I want to know, why are you putting me on this drug? How do you know I have this disease? Why are you not screening me for this? And I think that automatically removes a barrier. But I also think it's sort of created a false sense of the market for some of these companies because they think that the easiest way to sell everything is going to be direct to consumer. And if everybody bought everything that was on sale out on the floor right now, I mean, that would be great for those companies. But the reality is, like, we're very sophisticated healthcare consumers, and that's just, it's too much, it's too much. So while everyone's thinking about the direct to consumer, they're going to have to really start connecting those dots on who are going to be the entities that are most likely to pay for it, why are they going to pay for it, and how does it connect to care. So if you're doing a liver panel, or if you're studying liver function, or how are you connecting that to the use of a GLP? Because prescription of GLPs is directly related to improvement in liver health for some patients, particularly those who have MASH. How are you connecting, your coverage of a GLP to a patient's progression on MASH or their progression with diabetes? I think those are going to be the care loops that are going to have to get closed in order for the system and the payers, whether it be the employers who are definitely going to lead the way here, or commercial insurance to see value.
Okay, so you bring up a good point around technology and genomics with GLP-1s, right? How it's transformed diabetes care, obesity care, the fight against obesity. I'll ask you both this question. What diseases do you see in the next 5 to 10 years that will be transformed by genetics, genomics, and technology? And what will be the typical patient experience getting into the delivery of that transforms it?
I'm going to say mental health and neurodegenerative disease.
Yeah.
Because, historically we have done a terrible job of having diagnostic tools to make objective diagnostic decisions, just to diagnose people. I mean, we don't have tools to differentiate between major depressive disorder and bipolar disorder, despite the fact that those are two completely different diseases with completely different etiologies and different pathways that they're managed on. And when you treat a patient who's got bipolar disease with major depressive disorder and you make that medication mistake, their suicide risk goes up by 8-fold. Similarly, we don't have great diagnostic tools in the neurodegenerative space to differentiate between Alzheimer's and Lewy body dementia and normal pressure hydrocephalus and all of these things that can cause early signs of memory complaint. But we don't have the diagnostic tools. We haven't had them. But the tools that are coming to the market now that are imaging, that are blood-based, that are ocular, that are digital, are going to completely revolutionize and allow us to do primary diagnosis of these diseases, which is going to completely change how drugs are developed, how patients get access to the drugs, and then how they're able to get on a better treatment faster, because we're actually starting with the right diagnosis.
That's a really good one. It's really hard to follow. I can't stop thinking about the fact that in the last 2 months, I have met with 3 companies that are trying to identify lung cancer from breath. I can't stop thinking about the fact that I am looking at companies that are innovating these bags in order so that you can breathe into the bag and then you shut the bag and you ship it. And they do a microbiome analysis to help you manage IBS and a variety of other gut symptoms. They are looking at the balance between sulfur and other elements in your gut on the basis of your breath. And for me, I feel like we're entering this new age where maybe some cancers and some of this GI is going to start to get solved in this really non-invasive way. And I think a lot about the GI because I also feel like the gut-brain axis, we talk about that a lot. We think about GI from a metabolic perspective. We also have to think about GI when we think about the fact that the millennials are the least healthy generation in human history. We are so unhealthy that they are moving the screening guidelines back just for us, because we can't seem to get it together, before the age of 40. And so I just think a lot about the GI tract and how if we are suddenly unlocking breath for lung cancer would be incredible, because lung cancer screening rates are horrific. Only 5% of the people who are supposed to get screened for lung cancer, meaning you smoked a lot and you need to get screened, actually do get screened. But then I also think about so many people that are suffering with all of these GI symptoms. It takes months to get an appointment with a specialist. Impossible to walk through all this in a 15-minute time period. And now here we are about to start breathing in paper bags and FedExing them to laboratories. I think we're at the cusp of something totally innovative in GI, and I don't know where it's all going to go clinically, but I think it's significant.
That is really fascinating stuff. That's really fascinating. So, okay, you know how we end our show. We like to give 3 practical tips for people to have the language, the confidence to advocate for themselves and become better advocates for a precision medicine approach to their healthcare. But I think it's appropriate, because we have you here, to not only do 3 practical tips for patients and family members, but also 3 practical tips for providers to help build precision medicine programs, and also for payers to improve cost of care and outcomes. So you can take it however you want. First, give me 3 practical tips for both of you, for patients, just to advocate. And it doesn't have to be oncology or any specific disease, but what would you give as practical tips for someone who's watching this, who is interested and has a diagnosis that is maybe chronic disease, maybe genetic-based disease, to become better advocates for themselves?
I always say that the number one question that any patient should ever ask any caregiver or any physician or provider when being given some sort of a treatment, if it's a drug, if it's a surgery, if it's a whatever, is, how do I know this is going to work on me? How do you know as a doctor that this is going to work on me? Because I just feel like that opens the door for precision medicine. And most of the time, and this is why I'm going to have Hannah ask a hard question, most of the time, doctor's answer is going to be, gee, I really don't know. And that is how to get doctors closer to precision medicine. I feel like you have more experience with the provider piece of this, but that is, I would say, probably like one of the most significant challenges in the healthcare.
Absolutely. Powerful question.
Yeah, it's a really tough question. I mean, for patients, definitely, I completely agree. Ask your doctor why they're doing the thing that they're doing. And ask if there are diagnostics that could better inform your care. But a lot of the time, I think we're in this really challenging time in medicine, where medicine has been an art, where you go to the doctor who has the most experience in patients that look like you, patients that are similar to you. And I think that was fine when we didn't have these diagnostic tools, when we didn't have data, when we didn't understand genetics, just to make this assumption that, everyone who sort of looks like this should be treated like this and it'll work out. But now we're in this period where it is almost impossible for any physician to keep up with what is going on in the diagnostic space, in the data space, in genetics. There are whole subspecialties about this, not in medicine though. And that is really challenging for doctors who are getting pressured by their health systems and getting pressured by their payers, and now are expected to keep up with genetics and genomics and diagnostic tests and imaging and scans, and they can't do it. And so for physicians out there, I would say, don't be afraid to lean into the technology and the data that is available to you. There are a lot of physician decision support tools that are being built. They're most helpful when they've been built with physicians' input in mind. And a lot of these companies are looking to reach out to physicians and get their perspective. So, if you have the opportunity to give that perspective, that's really helpful. And then you asked about for payers too.
Yes.
So, there are three buckets of payers in the U.S. We've got government payers, we've got commercial payers, and then we've got employers. I do wish government payers would realize the value that they are leaving on the table for Americans right now by the fact that our government is so reticent to cover diagnostic tools. It is so much harder to get diagnostics paid for than it is to get drugs paid for. And, the most ridiculous example we have right now in the U.S., I think, is in Alzheimer's disease, where we have a couple of drugs on the market for Alzheimer's disease that are both very expensive and have a very high rate of side effects, meaning that you're likely to have brain complications of swelling and something called ARIA. You need to be monitored. You're not allowed to travel. It's a really significant thing. But Medicare pays for it. Mm-hmm. Medicare does not pay for the diagnostics that diagnose and monitor and tell you if you have Alzheimer's, what kind of Alzheimer's you have. And the gap between those things is just incredible, because we're definitely missing an opportunity to treat patients better. We are wasting a huge amount of money by treating patients for things that they do not have, by covering drugs for diseases where the patients don't have that disease because we didn't pay for the diagnostic. And that's coming out of our pockets. That comes out, whether it's Medicaid or whether it's Medicare, that comes out of all of our pockets. But, for the employers, this is really the opportunity. Yeah. Diagnostics are the tools that can improve care for every single employee. They're the tools that can enable you to prevent disease, to slow disease down, to anticipate it early, to make sure that your employees are productive at work. And also, it's something that we have companies that we've worked with that have implemented these programs, and the employees are so happy that it makes them feel more loyal. They want to work for you because they feel like their employer is actually taking care of them.
They're looking out for them.
They're looking out for them. If your employer is that invested in making sure that you're healthy, you're on the right drug, that we screened you for your disease early because we knew what your risk was, even though your employer, just speak there, this is not a HIPAA violation. Your employer doesn't actually know who the risk is for. They just know it's for their employees. That engenders a different kind of relationship that really aligns stakeholders, and it aligns them for the better care of the employee and the better fiscal responsibility of the employer. But our government hasn't figured that out.
Lena, I'll leave this last comment for you. Speaking directly to employers, health plans, as it pertains to genetics, genomics, and technology, what are the 3 tips that you would give them that they need to pay attention to that might be emerging, or things that are already out there that they may not be aware of, that not taking advantage of? What would you give them to pay attention to take action on, to improve cost of care, also patient outcomes?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think about this actually a lot now, because we do a lot of work with employers. We do a lot of work with benefits consultants and brokers. And one of the biggest questions that they come to us with is like, how do I think about this space, right? And what I always say is, how can we and how can you look at the data, right? Because an employer only has the assumption that all the care that they paid for was the right care. They don't have a way of checking that. But there are a lot of ways to check that. And so the first tip that I would say, and the first question that you should ask, is how can I work with my employer? How can I, as the employer, look at my data and figure out how much of the money I spent was a waste? And I use the word waste because waste is the term that employers are like, oh, that's painful, right? Like, that's a painful. But they need to understand that a lot of the claims that they pay, a lot of the things that they're paying for, they are paying for drugs that never worked and were never going to work. They're paying for procedures that came too late and so were not going to be effective. They paid for, any variety of things. They paid for They paid to underscreen certain people and they paid to overscreen other people, right? They paid for the paranoia of the worried well, and they paid for the fact that some people didn't have the health literacy to ask for the things that their family history shows they really needed, like yesterday. So I think that word waste really activates people in a productive way. And it also kind of, employers are good at thinking about waste because they know to the cent what they pay for all their gadgets and widgets, and they know to a cent what they pay for W-2s, right? So why are they writing a blank check for the number 2 most expensive thing that they manage? And I think that is a helpful way to think about it. And then the second thing that I always say to them is, do not assume that what your traditional insurance company or carrier covers is the full extent to what science has proven or what healthcare believes to be correct. There's a very linear assumption that employers make, which is that if my carrier covers it, it's good. And if my carrier doesn't cover it, it's unproven. And unfortunately, carriers are actuaries. They work on a 12-month cycle. They cover what works. They cover what works for their actuarial math. When the math maths, they cover it. And when it doesn't, they don't. And that doesn't have a lot to do with what is scientifically proven, what is innovative and proven, what is going to decrease the total cost of care. And I think a lot of people say this, I think people are worried to talk about financial incentives. Look, financial incentives are a fact of life, right? They're certainly a fact of life in a capitalist society. And I think what we forget is that insurance companies, like the biggest insurance companies, are public. Their product is not healthcare, their product is stock price. We just need to know what we're dealing with. And when we know what we're dealing with, we can create solutions instead of all of this non-productive finger pointing. Things are the way that they are, right? But employers can make different decisions when they think about things that way. And we have found that to be a very productive way of working with our employer clients and working with brokers, and of really starting to introduce innovative precision programs and strategies that, are totally proven. It's just that, the carrier never covered them because they were operating off of a different set of what was important.
Well, I got to say that after our conversation, I'm less overwhelmed because I see a path with all this technology that is flooding our healthcare market, and I guess it's always been that way. But they're coming to fruition in real ways that we can see the light at the end of the tunnel for the improvement of the outcomes and diseases, while also being a better steward of our healthcare dollars. Right?
Yeah, I think you are not going to stop this consumer wave. It is unstoppable. And I think by the time that this wave hits the shore, all of American healthcare will be completely different, because you just have too many people with dollars in their wallets that are happy to swipe their cards and pay online and get what they need. And that is, they never designed traditional insurance for that kind of consumer demand. So I think you're absolutely right.
I can't thank you guys enough. Lena Chaihorsky and Anna Mamauszka of Alva 10, our good friends from Alva 10. Thank you for co-hosting our health episode in this wonderful podcast booth. And I'm really excited about, this is only day one, by the way, it was only a half a day, but I'm really excited about what's to come. So thank you for breaking it down and sharing to us what we should be looking out for coming out of this conference and into the future. Thanks for being a guest on Genetics for Healthcare.
Thanks for having me. Thank you so much.
This is Genetics for Healthcare, a podcast for patients.